Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Kelly.
My name is Doug.
And we are excited about this episode as we continue in our series of grief. If you haven't already checked out our first episode, Doug and his wife, Suzanne, share part of their story, their journey through grief. It wasn't short, and it didn't all heal up in like a perfect bow, but you guys were able to share how you found hope, how you found healing, how you've used what you've went through to shape the rest of your life. So we want to continue sharing stories like that, and you're going to hear more of them this season. But today's guest is actually a really wise sage, I'll say. Doug, tell us more about who we're going to hear from today.
Yeah, so Julianna Guevara is a licensed mental health counselor, and she's really here to guide us through this process of what does it mean to understand grief and process grief. And she's studied grief, she's experienced grief, and it's always good to have a guide because sometimes we just don't know what to do or think or feel with what's going on in our lives. And so Julianna has been doing this for 15 years. She's helped so many people that I know personally, people in our sphere, friends and people that we attend church with and do life with. And so she's been a wise and faithful sage leading people through this process. So looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, it is a good conversation, and I'm excited because she not only shares wisdom from her own experience and her own practice, but also just really simple, practical ways that you can either walk through your own grief or serve others that are going through grief. So we'll make sure to include all of that information in the show notes, but for now, sit back and enjoy the conversation.
So Julianna, we are so glad you're joining us today. So you're a licensed mental health counselor. How does a person get into that field of work?
Oh, man. So my story is a little unique in that I knew that I wanted to be a counselor at the age of 10.
Wow.
Yeah.
10. What was happening that you knew? Like, how did you know even about
So that's
counseling?
a good question.
Yeah.
So when I was 8, I actually came and spoke to my mom about some sexual abuse that I was experiencing. And so she and my dad got me into counseling, and I was able to walk through that with a counselor and found a lot of healing at the tender age of 8.
Wow.
And then at the age of 10, I was in a Bible study, like a Sunday school, and there were different groups, and each group had a different scenario that they had to act out. Okay. And there was a group of boys that got the scenario, your babysitter's touching you in inappropriate places, what do you do?
Wow.
And they got up there, and they were just cracking up. They could not do like their performance or whatever. And so I went up to the teacher, and I was like, hey, can I say something to the class? She had no idea what I was going to say. But I got up
you're
there.
10.
I'm 10.
Okay,
Yes,
okay.
10.
Like
Just
in fourth
10
grade.
year old. Wow,
Fourth
okay.
grade, exactly. And so I go up in front of the class, and I was like, listen, this is nothing to laugh about. Like, this happens to people. This happens to people that you know. It happened to me. And if it's happening to you, I want you to go and tell somebody.
Wow.
And then I stormed out of that classroom, and I went to the bathroom, and 2 of my little friends came running after me, making sure I was okay. And when they got in the bathroom, there was nobody else in there. And both of them were like, this actually happened to us, and we haven't told anybody.
Wow.
And it was like in that moment, in my little 10-year-old heart, the Lord spoke to me and was like, listen, this pain, there's a purpose in that, and it's not in vain. And so, this is going to be something that you use for your story in the future and to help others. And so, that's why my verse is 2 Corinthians 1, 3, and 4. And the Julianna version is, praise the God of all comfort that comforts us when we're going through hard times so that we can comfort others when they're going through hard times.
Wow.
And so that was just like the kickstart of my journey through counseling and through wanting to help others with my story.
So fill us in on the rest of the journey. So you go to school, you get your degree, like you're trying to figure out how do I do this counseling and how does that work for a person who's like, maybe God's called me to enter into that same space.
Yeah. So to be a licensed therapist, depending on your state, there's different rules. But here in Florida, you have to have your master's degree, and then you have to do registered internship, and then you have to be like a part of the state and have a bunch of like liability stuff and all these things, and do lots of hours and lots of school.
Right.
But yeah, like the path to get there, especially when you're in like your furthering in like your bachelor's and your master's, like you're excited about those classes because it's what you want to do. So it might sound long and like painful, But really, it's a cool part of the journey of just learning more and growing and challenging yourself, because you have to do a lot of the work too when you're in school. It's not just you're going to go learn how to like fix people. No, like you got to challenge yourself and look at your own stuff that you've been through, your traumas and your story too.
So put us in the counseling room. Someone comes to see Julianna. What do they expect, and what are you thinking about as you meet this person for the first time?
Yeah. So I know it's nerve-wracking going in. I've been that person that goes in with a new therapist and you're like, oh my goodness, I got to bare my soul to somebody. And so it's not to be taken lightly. Like, yes, it's a sacred space. But the first session, a lot of times it's just us gathering information. And so as counselors, we need to know like a full picture. So they're going to be asking you questions like what you eat or how you sleep and medical stuff. And so the first session really is try to ease you in and get comfortable in the space. And I think it's really, really important that you connect with that person too. Yeah. And so in the first session, maybe you're a little bit too nervous and you're like, I don't really know if there was a connection or not. Most times you do know in that first session, but if not, then give it a second session. And if that still there isn't that connection, or you just feel like you're talking to a wall, then it's time to try another therapist out. Yeah. No harm in that.
So let's say someone's sitting before you and they're sharing their story, you're gathering information. What are you looking for? To follow up and give them insight? Yeah.
So what I'm looking for is any kind of areas of dysfunction in their life, right? So relationships, social life, at work, in their sleep and in their eating, so we're looking for these patterns that are dysfunctional, and also symptoms that they're having too, of just like stress or anxiety and depressive symptoms. And so I'm trying to gather information on all of that to get a whole picture of how this person's life has been impacted in this moment. Because something has happened to where they've said, or a loved one has said, you need to go and talk to a therapist. Yeah. And so I want to get to the bottom of that and also get a clear picture of what's going on around it.
And so once you're able to look at there was a trauma that you experienced, like a sexual abuse or the abandonment of a father or mother, what do you then do with that trauma? How do you explain the trauma? How do you dialogue about the trauma, and how do you help them process that trauma?
Yeah, I think educating them about trauma is really important, because it's this kind of term that's out there, and there's so many extremes to trauma that we can feel like, oh, well, this isn't trauma. Like, no, I didn't go through a trauma. We can kind of be in a little bit denial, if you will. And so explain to them that, yes, this was in fact traumatic for you. And these symptoms that you're experiencing and the way that it is difficult to relate to others are the effects that are felt from that traumatic experience. And so when we're looking at trauma, we also want to bring in our body to it, because we're body, mind, soul. And so sometimes we don't understand, like, why am I having panic attacks? Why can't I sleep? Why is my appetite suppressed? Or why am I eating too much? So there's things that are happening physiologically that we don't really know how to explain. And so when we're able to say, no, this is how trauma stays locked in our body until we actually do the work to work it out. Yeah. And also too, there's medical things that can be happening. So I always advise to go and see a doctor to get some blood work, because even trauma experienced long term, for example, our cortisol levels can stay spiked for a long time, and then we have adrenal fatigue, and then that has a whole slew of other symptoms. And so it's really helpful to get to the root of what's going on. And so once that trauma is identified, then the trauma therapy approaches to help work that out. So it's going to include body, mind, and soul.
So I remember you once said to me, and I'll never forget this, you said that often depression is an accumulation of unprocessed grief. I don't know if you remember saying that.
Sounds super smart.
Yeah, it sounds super smart. So you probably said it.
No,
but I'll never forget that phrase. There's this accumulation of unprocessed grief that we go through in our life. Talk to us about that.
Oof. Yes. Grief, I've heard it said that there are as many definitions of grief as there are people. Grief is so unique. And so it's different for each person, which can feel very isolating. But at the same time, having permission to experience that grief and to walk out that grief in a way that it might look different from other persons. Some people just, they're not big criers, for example, but they feel shame for not crying, right? And so just being okay with, hey, it's okay. Today, you might be a bucket of tears. Tomorrow, you might be laughing and smiling and having a good time. But when it comes to trying to process through that grief, and if we just keep it stuffed, we just try to numb it away or distract ourselves or stuff it down, eventually it's going to come out. And so that is the common occurrence of grief, is that you're going to experience the pain at some point. So trying to stuff it away or pretending like it's not there is not going to be helpful.
And in that, it coming out, like what does that look like for people? What are some examples of how grief comes out in somebody's life?
Yeah, so grief can look like being really short-fused, being very angry. Also, the eating, the sleeping, those kinds of things, the functioning, the levels of functioning can be altered. But too, like the interpersonal reactions, when we maybe are more outgoing and now we're starting to stay at home. And there is going to be a period too, and there's going to be days, which again, like you got to be patient with yourself, because there might be days where you're like, I just need to stay in bed and I don't want to see anybody today. And that's okay. That's temporary. And so what we know about emotions is that they are temporary. So let's not treat them as if they're going to be permanent. Let's say, okay, yeah, today I am really sad and I'm going to stay in bed today. And that's okay. But we can't make that a pattern either.
Right.
We can't make that our comfort of just staying in bed all the time.
Right.
Because there's so many different emotions and processes of grief. And so the research and stuff that has come from grief, and this has been long studied for centuries, grief is something that has always been felt as a human condition.
Right.
And so back in 1969, there is this woman, her name was 𝘼𝘼𝙍𝙍 and she came out with 5 stages of grief. And so a lot of people know about these 5 stages. And so just to briefly cover them, there is denial, there is bargaining, there's anger, there's depression, and there's acceptance. And so what we know about these stages is that they're not linear stages that we actually like just walk through one by one.
Right.
Like, check
I've
that
achieved
off.
this. I've bargained this.
Right, exactly. No, it is a constant flow of all of those different emotions and more complex ones. They're just in a mixed bag. And you don't know from one moment to the next what that emotion is going to be like. And so I've heard it said, it's like you're sitting on your porch and there's cars passing you by. And so each one of those cars represents a different emotion of grief.
Okay.
And so it's important that you sit there and you let that car pass by, like, okay, feeling angry right now. Okay, maybe this was kind of funny. I remember this funny memory. But when we go chasing after one of those cars, that is when we can start to feel like the effects, the deep effects of grief in a way that's not going to be helpful for us. But we're going to latch on to, well, I need to be laughing all the time, or I need to be super happy all the time because that's what they would want. And then we're denying the parts of us that are sad, right? And so I like that analogy of just like watching the cars go by, acknowledging each emotion that comes, and not chasing down one of those cars of like the anger, for example, of like, no, I have a right to be angry. I'm going to be angry all the time. Yeah, you do have a right to be angry.
Yeah, and
it's awful.
In that analogy, it points out the fact that car could pass by again.
Yeah.
So it's like,
yep, exactly, and that's what happens.
The grief or like the depression could come again, or so instead of claiming it just as that one season, that one chapter.
Yeah, and not feeling like a failure, like you're failing in grief when it comes up again, when it resurfaces, because there's so many layers.
You thought you got over it. Like,
yeah, right. And there's this word picture. So if I can take the listeners in on this, I saw this word picture probably last year and it has stuck with me. And I think it's such a good depiction of how grief is. So there's 2 pictures. One picture on top has 3 mason jars. They're all the same size. And in the first jar, there's a big ball. In the second jar, there's a smaller ball. And in the third jar, there's even a smaller ball. And it says, this is what we think grief is like. But then the second picture has 3 mason jars. However, one is very big, the first one, and it has a ball in it that's like the tennis-sized ball. The second is a jar that's also even bigger than that one and it has a tennis ball in it, the same size. And then the third one is even a larger jar with a tennis ball. And it says, this is how grief really is, because we just grow around the grief. The grief itself doesn't minimize. It's not like the pain softens or becomes non-existent, but we grow around the grief. And I just thought that picture was so,
picture,
right?
Wow,
Yeah, it just
because
so
we think that one day it will like shrink to nothing.
Yeah.
But the reality is, like you said, you're growing as a person to be able to handle the grief in a new way, a different way as it comes.
Yeah.
Like we've heard in Doug and Suzanne's story, and we're going to hear in stories coming up, grief is triggered again later on in life because of circumstances or a new trauma, But like you're saying, the approach to that grief is now different. They've grown as a person. So that's really encouraging. Thank you for sharing that. That's a great way to look at it.
All right, so I want to talk about two extremes when it comes to the way people view counseling. So the first one is I don't need to talk to a counselor, even though I have a friend whose parents and spouse and people say you should go to counseling. That's not me. It's my friend. So what do you say to persons like I don't need counseling, even if people are telling me I don't want some psychobabble, some contemplating my life. I'm not looking back at the past. I'm looking to the future. What do you say to a person like that who's just straight up resistant?
Well, one thing would be like, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid is going to happen? Because the counseling room does have to be a safe place. And so perhaps they've had a negative experience in the past that has made counseling seem unsafe, or they've talked to somebody that had a bad experience. But with a lot of things in life, like you got to go and test the waters yourself and see, okay, is this something that I can benefit from, or is it just a waste of time? But I would say give it that shot, because if people are telling you, these are people that care about you, that you trust, and they're saying like, hey, I think it's really time for you to talk to somebody, trust them in that. We have so many blind spots, each and every one of us. And so if people who mean well for you and want what's best for you are encouraging you to do something that, even though it might seem crazy, then I would suggest like, go and try that out. What do you have to lose?
Right. Okay, so the other extreme is someone who says, I need to be in counseling twice a week for the rest of my life. And things are so, I'll use the word fragile, that I'm a victim of something every week. My boss spoke to me harshly, my spouse disrespected me, my kids don't listen to me, no one understands me. And that extreme, how do you help shape a person or direct a person who's in that view of counseling?
Well, first, if they're actually in therapy already, I would say change therapists, because if their therapist is allowing them to be that reliant on them. But therapy, the goal of therapy is that we never see the clients again at some point. And I joke about that with my clients, because they do become a part of your life. Like you love. These are other humans and other experiences, and they're inviting you in these most sacred spaces. And you're becoming a huge part
of their life.
Right.
Like they're...
Yes. And so I ask them, like,
coming
please,
to you with huge things. Yeah.
Totally. And in big parts, traumatic parts sometimes of their lives. And so I always encourage them, like, you can reach out and just let me know how you're doing. I love that. But the end goal is that you have all the tools you need to navigate through life. And if you need to check back in once a year or whatever, that's fine. But it's not supposed to be a codependent type relationship, which is why I joke. Like if you are, or actually I'm serious in that if you are seeing a therapist that is allowing you to do the 2 times a week for forevermore, let's see someone else who's going to give you those tools that you don't need to see that person that often. For that
All right, so that brings me to another question. So as a therapist, you're also a human being who's gone through your own trauma, your own process. How much do you bring your own story in to help a person navigate their story?
Yeah. So each person is different. Some, and that's where discernment comes in, because some can take a lot of strength from whatever I've experienced or somebody else has experienced, as an encouragement for their own story, and give them a ray of hope. Whereas others, it may not be so helpful. It might add insult to injury, if you will. And so there's discernment that comes with that, but they know, and in fact, day one, I tell them I'm going to be asking them a lot of questions, and if they don't want to answer anything, like they can just let me know that they don't want to answer it, and that's totally fine. And I tell them, I'm like, you're free to ask me whatever you want to. I'm a pretty open book, but if there's something that you ask me that I want to answer, I also have the permission not to answer. And so I'm pretty open about my story, and if people were to like Google my name or whatever, you'd see a lot of different things that pop up in regards to my story, because it has been out there more than maybe another therapist would have. But that's just my own journey. And so my journey also gives me a huge insight into that pain, and we all have gone through something, whether that is trauma, grief, felt sadness, felt isolation, felt abandonment. Like we all have these shared emotional experiences. And so it doesn't have to be exact in order to feel like, okay, I can relate to this person, or I can get into the depths with them. Like we have all had these human emotions. And so we don't have to compare our story to another and be like, oh, well, no, they can't relate to me because it's not that bad or whatever.
Yeah. So one other thing I remember you sharing, this was a couple of years ago, that we want to be people who share out of our scars and out of our wounds.
Yes.
So talk more about that, because as a therapist, if you're still going through something that's very fresh, sharing it with someone else could be bad for you and bad for them. So how do you know, when do I share my own story?
Yes. So this saying of we share from our scars and not from our wounds, because when we are wounded, that is still open. We're open to infection. We're open to people saying something that can trip us up and cause even more infection. And so when we are wounded, we have to be in a sterile environment. We have to be around people who really want what's best for us, who are very trustworthy, and protect that wound. That the only people who are allowed to speak into that are the people that are safe and healthy around me. And then when we are scarred, we have a scar that shows, okay, this happened, but it's not tender to touch anymore. I can touch it. It can be poked or prodded, and it's not going to hurt anymore. But this is just a symbol that this did in fact happen. And so when we're sharing our story, or we're thinking about sharing our story, I always encourage people, are you sharing from a scar that because people are going to say some really crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Right? If you're going to be wounded, if they say something, then you're not ready to share. Right? But if it's scarred over where you're like, okay, nope, they can say whatever they want and it doesn't change who I am or my worth or my importance and who I am in God, then our stories are so impactful. And there are people or there are situations that they're like, okay, I don't think I can share this with somebody. And that's for each person to decide. But when we do say, okay, I am ready to share my story, I want to tell this person, I want to walk through this crisis with this person, it is so impactful how our story just has a ripple effect into somebody else's story.
Yeah.
So what does it feel like? Because you've shared very publicly, I've gone through sexual abuse, I've gone through cancer, I've gone through lots of these events that are pretty traumatic and could be life-shaping. What is it like when you've processed that, you've processed the grief, you've found healing, and now you actually share it with someone else and you watch them have that aha moment? What does that feel like?
Yeah. I mean, like I mentioned in the beginning, 2 Corinthians 1, 3, and 4 is we give others comfort that we've received. And so when I see that, I'm just reminded of how much comfort I've received myself. Yeah. And so it's energizing, it's exciting. The flip side of that too is that having been through cancer, for example, working with kids who have cancer, that's a hard one. Survivor's guilt is real. Yeah. And so even as a therapist, that's one area that is still hard when I have to go for my appointments or I go through the oncology wing for pediatrics and stuff. And it's just, that's hard. And you're like, what? I thank God, I'm here. And for those of you listening, I was also pregnant at the time that I was going through cancer.
That's right.
And so I have so much to be grateful for. And so survivor's guilt isn't like me wishing that I had died or anything like that, but it's just wow, we were able to beat this. My daughter's healthy. I'm healthy. And then seeing these other kids go through that. And so being a therapist, being human, there are still those emotions, those raw emotions that I have to acknowledge, and so there'll be times that, I'm crying when I see a patient, or I've had, clients and stuff that have passed, children that passed, and that my husband, just a day of crying, I'm like, okay, get this out. And then every time I see something that reminds me of them, one in particular, I'm thinking she loved Stitch. And so I have been seeing Stitch everywhere, and she passed away about 1.5 years ago. And I see Stitch everywhere now from Lilo and Stitch. And so that just is a reminder, because I'm human and I'm a therapist, but it was such a sacred part that I was able to walk through with her in her journey. Yeah.
Wow, that's beautiful.
You've talked multiple times about this, and obviously it's just part of who you are, but taking this grief, taking this pain, turning it into purpose, that's possible for everyone. There's an invitation into making what you've gone through in your life to give it purpose, to give it meaning, to have a reason behind it. Can you talk a little bit about how you get there? Obviously that comes through counseling, but in the stories that are to come, we're going to have a conversation with friends who have all walked through cancer. We're going to have a conversation with parents who are raising kids with special needs. And I'm sure in seasons to come, we'll talk about other people's stories. But the reality is, you're saying what we believe. We value everybody's story. Everybody has a unique story, something unique to offer. But how do you get from a place of deep grief and those 5 stages you're talking about to there's a reason that not only I can get past this, but become something from this?
Yeah. That's a really great question. And there's so many different layers too of our story. And so I like what you said, because there's sometimes where as onlookers of somebody grieving, we try to rush that process. And we're like, no, but everything works together for good.
Right.
Like, okay.
All the things that you shouldn't say to somebody while they're going through something hard.
Right. I mean, and it's true, like eventually, but that's not where they're at right now. Right. So when you're walking aside somebody, allowing that space for them to be in pain. And that's a hard space to fill as a human, because we try to resist that painful feeling in our own life. And so when it's somebody else that we care about, we just want to like, oh, can we just
save
do
them,
something?
help
Right.
them. Yeah.
Yes. And it is not our job to take away their pain. That's for sure. But when it comes to finding purpose through that, a lot of times that comes through not just therapy, but through connecting with others. And that's also a process in and of itself, because in the beginning stages, we might be more isolated. We might just resent the world too. And so I think, as I'm on this point, right, real quick, there are some non-stereotypical ways of dealing with grief that can also cause like some shame feeling.
Okay.
Which, for example, relief. Relief can be an emotion that's felt from grief. And that can be very filled with guilt of like, well, how can I be feeling relief right now that they're not here? But that is a very real experience that is felt, or feeling peace. Or even the flip side, feeling jealous of others, and like not wanting to go to other people's functions because, for example, with miscarriage, it's like, well, I don't want to go to any baby showers right now. Like I can't, I'm not in that space where I can, yes, I'm happy for them, but like I can't be in that space and be constantly reminded. And so we also have to be patient with ourselves too. And so coming out of this pain and finding that purpose is going to be a journey. If somebody was to tell me that they went through this traumatic grief and then they're like, okay, yep, I found the purpose, I'm good, ready to go. I'm like, no. You haven't really done all the work
later.
yet. Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah. No. It does take time. And that pain is real and it's deep. And that's why having a support system is really helpful. And some of that purpose is found through having that support system, because we don't know what that support system is going to feel eventually, what they're going to experience. And so allowing them to be a blessing for you in that life and that experience, is going to help them perhaps in their life with an experience that they have. And so again, it's this ripple effect that we have. And so finding purpose too, like for a lot of people that looks like creating like a memorial or having some kind of advocacy group. And so for example, children with special needs, that is a big grief that's felt. There's a lot of these expectations, a lot of these dreams, a lot of these visions you have. As soon as you see those two lines, you're like thinking about their wedding day. I mean, you're already there.
Yeah.
And so when you experience the diagnoses, the chronic illnesses, like all of these things are huge blows to the expectations and the hopes and the dreams that we had. And so those need to be felt.
Yeah.
And a lot of people will try to find purpose and work out that pain through advocating for special needs, or through cancer groups, or, even just doing like arranging meals and GoFundMe's and stuff like that, right? And so we can find purpose through those things. And it doesn't have to be like necessarily sharing from a platform and inviting others to be real in what they're feeling too, and leading the way in that vulnerability. It can just be those simple acts of kindness.
So back to the mason jar and what you're talking about, how we grow around our grief.
Yes.
So sometimes we try to avoid grief, we deny grief, but you're talking about like grief actually as a catalyst that allows us to grow into a different type of person.
Yes.
So describe that process for the listener that's like, right now, I don't like this experience. I don't want to feel these things. And I wish I could just like turn the page and move on. But you're suggesting like a whole different way to see something, that grief is a catalyst for growth.
Yeah.
Tell us more about that and what you've seen in your own life and the life of the people you serve.
Yeah. I heard one person say to befriend their grief. And that sounds very upside down. Because like you said, we want to get rid of grief. Like grief is like our enemy. Like I just want it out of my life.
I feel like people would be like, I'd rather not go through this at all. You know, I didn't ask for this.
Totally.
So it's like avoid at all costs, but there's an invitation.
Correct. Because in that grief, there is significance of the loss that's felt, right? So the deep emotions that we feel, the deep pain that we experience are in great proportion to the depth of love that you had for that person and the importance that they had in your life. or in dreaming these dreams that you had for
Yeah.
your children, or these relationships, these breakups and things that happen, different scenarios. And so it's not running from that grief or these uncomfortable emotions, but it's befriending them. It's like, okay, what are you trying to teach me right now? Okay, yes, I am really angry right now. I'm jealous at everything. Or there's even like competitive grief where like, oh, but your grief isn't as bad as mine, right? Like what I'm experiencing is worse. And so you just need to like.
It's the one-upper of grief. Yeah.
Yes. And that can happen too.
Yeah.
And so if you're listening and you're feeling like that, don't feel shame.
Nope.
That's part of the experience, but also acknowledge too that, okay, this is what I'm experiencing right now. Let me feel it. For some, anger, for example, kickboxing is really great, getting it out, or like smashing. There's a place here in South Florida you can go and like smash stuff.
I actually have looked one of those up
We
before.
did that.
Did you?
My son and I. We
Did
did it
you?
together.
Wow.
How was that?
We didn't have much anger because after we broke everything, we're like, okay, let's go have a cheeseburger. But
Good, you got rid of it. That's
got rid of
great.
it.
You
It was
smashed
fun.
stuff.
That's so good. So yeah, there's things that we can do like to work out the anger. Or like if we're really sad, or if we're feeling very anxious, sometimes it's listening to that song that reminds us of that experience or that person. And so there's things that we can do to aid in our healing and to acknowledge the existence of that other person or idea, the dream that we had that's no longer there. So yeah, as we grow around this grief, it does take it's a quote too that comes to mind is, in order for growth to happen, we have to get outside of our comfort zone.
Yeah.
And so grief is super uncomfortable. We want to run away from that. But in that time, like there is so much opportunity for growth and seeing different parts of ourselves that come out. Maybe we're just a very docile people pleaser, and then we see this fury come out of us and we're like, oh my goodness, what is this? Well, wow, like perhaps that that you have is going to be used for something good, to have like a passion behind advocacy or whatever that turns into.
yeah, I see like in the pages of the Bible, there's constantly this encouragement to embrace the trials and the difficulties because they produce something. They produce perseverance. I'm not gonna quit on God or myself or my friends or my calling, and that produces character, and that produces hope, and that hope doesn't disappoint us. That this process of going, I'm going to embrace the number of trials. I remember hearing a guy one time say, after his wife died of cancer, I want to be a good steward of this trial. I didn't pick this for my life, but God brought it into my life, and I want to not just heal well, but allow that to serve and help someone else.
Yeah. And
so
I can identify with that. And my cancer diagnosis that I had was just like feeling the weight of those words in that moment, but at the same time knowing that we were going to be okay. And I wanted to do this well, like not to show people, not to be showy or anything like that, but just like I knew that there were people that were journeying alongside of us, because my husband and I experienced infertility before I got pregnant, which further complicated the diagnosis of cancer, because everybody was like rooting for us and cheering us on. We had a blog at the time, and so there were people all over the world that were so excited and celebrating with us. And then when I had to post that I had this diagnosis of leukemia, and I felt like I was dropping bombs on people. I felt bad for telling them that, like, hey, by the way, like we're all celebrating, and this is what I'm going through right now. But yeah, that perseverance part is so important, because that perseverance means that we're going to have opposition. Perseverance doesn't come when we're just like
pushing
smooth sailing
through something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's a great verse that you referenced, because we persevere, and that then creates like our character, refines our character. Right.
Yeah, it's good.
Oh,
so I'm asking for a friend. So
I love these.
So as a pastor, I know regularly I'm hearing people talk about their pain, their disappointment with God, their disappointment in other people themselves. And when you do that after a while, how do you like not absorb that pain into yourself, or allow it to consume you or keep you up at night? Like how do you create a boundary? Like, now I'm going to go play with my daughter and have an ice cream cone, and thinking that the world is all falling apart, but I'm also human. How do I have my own life? Asking for a friend.
Yeah, asking for a friend. So, well, being a therapist, there's boundaries, if you will, that we have to have too, of like, okay, one thing that is burned into my mind, I work for I'm contracted with Sheridan House Family Ministries. I've been there for 15 years now. And so one thing that Bob Barnes, who leads the ministry, has burned into our minds is that you are not the savior. So God has placed you in somebody's journey at a specific time for a specific purpose, and you are not to save them. But there is one savior, and that is Jesus Christ himself. And so that being burned in my mind has helped bring me so much freedom to not feel that burden of like, I have to solve this for them or I'm supposed to lessen their pain. That is an act of the Holy Spirit. And so my role in that person's life is finite and it's just for that specific time and purpose. And so I have to trust that the Lord's using me in whatever that is, but 9 to 5 or whatever that is. And like, okay, Lord, this is what I've put on the altar and this is how I'm serving them. And now my first ministry is my family. And so I'm going to go and I'm going to serve them well too. So there has to be like that boundary and my own practice, and taking time off and all of that's really important too. But yeah, like we are human. And so feeling the depths of these pains, like there's been days where I've had to go and like lift heavy weights after, because I'm just like so infuriated that there was such an injustice. And so I'm like, I'm going to give this a good workout and then I'm going to feel better, you know? And so I have to work that.
You're even using
out.
The tools.
Yes,
you're
absolutely.
using
Absolutely.
the grief management, if you'll say, okay.
Yes. Or kickboxing and things like that just like, get it out. And it's really important. So when you're in a helping profession, such as a pastor, even though you're talking about a friend, but I'm sure your friend's a pastor too. We've got to take care of ourselves. We can't, pour from an empty vessel.
Right.
So filling ourselves up and reminding ourselves too that that's their journey. And so even though they might feel like there's no hope, we know that there's hope. We've journeyed some of this, or we've seen others journey it. And so we're like, okay, I know that there's still hope. I know that this is a catalyst to something great. And they can't see that yet. And so I'm going to believe it for them. But I'm not going to like force that down their throat, because like there's a process that they're going through too. But I am holding that space of believing this for them.
Yeah. As you were talking, a question that came to mind is like, okay, you're a counselor and obviously you need the boundaries. You have to live your life. You have a family and it's important. It helps us grow when you have boundaries. But if I'm the person listening and I've just gone through something so traumatic, I just got a diagnosis, my loved one just passed away, I'm carrying that grief every day, every moment of the day. I'm trying to figure out how to live in between those moments. And I only meet with you once a week. What? How rude, But in reality, I think that there's a part that community plays. So can you talk about what community can do? What can a community offer? If I don't have a community, what detriment is that to me walking through something traumatic, something that's piling grief into my life?
Yes. So first off, if you don't have a community, there are grief groups out there, which is very beneficial. Even if you do have a community. Grief groups are really healing, and just, it might sound counterintuitive, but like sitting in a room full of people that are experiencing grief and going through different emotions at different times can be so healing and helpful, because it can give us like a pathway, if you will, and permission even just to feel the huge extremes of emotions going through grief and these different experiences, or something that somebody else has tried and they're saying, you're like, okay, maybe I can try this too. And it helps. And so there's a lot of benefit that can come from a group therapy. But also, yes, community, if you do have a community, super, super important. There's even apps out there that actually will help your community. So there's one I'm thinking of called Help Texts. And what it does is you sign up and then you give 2 support people permission to access. And so this app will text them different things to do, different, whether that's different actions to take or different ideas or different questions to ask or things to bring up. And so that can be a really helpful tool. And it also helps the person grieving by like identifying different parts of the journey and normalizing them and saying like, yes, this is going to be felt. And so there are apps like that.
That is so cool. Yeah, because a lot of times people walking next to somebody going through that process don't know how to help. So it's great to have those little reminders or ideas come right to your phone. That's very convenient.
Yes, exactly. So
we love 2023.
That's right. Yeah, just a follow-up question. Most people that are in friend groups of people that are in grief, sometimes you're like, I'm not a professional counselor. I don't. How do I know where my boundaries are so we don't become this like codependent mess where I'm like solving all their problems and I have the Messiah complex because I'm trying to fix my friend or help my friend. As a lay person who's like, I don't have this training, what should they know about when to say, I need to create a boundary, or I need to refer you to someone else?
Yeah. So walking alongside somebody that's experiencing grief, like first and foremost, your responsibility is not to fix their pain or to diminish their pain, because that's just not possible. That's not in anybody's human capacity. As a therapist, like that's not my goal. I want to help them function and to alleviate some of these symptoms. But the pain part of it is a real felt experience that encompasses grief. And so that's going to be felt. Also, there's not like a one size fits all approach to grief because it's so unique. For example, some people want to hear they like, I'm so sorry that your father passed away. Yeah. Whereas another person is like, I don't want to hear that. I feel like they're pitying me and I don't want anybody's pity. Yep. Right. So and you might catch them on a different day. Maybe one day they do want to hear that. And so it can feel like, oh my goodness, oh, what do I do? What do I do? But what I really want to emphasize is that I don't want to go over a list of like what not to say, because that can paralyze people from just showing up.
Doing anything.
Yeah. And that is what's most important. Like just show up, be there. So even as a therapist, like when I'm interacting with friends and family, like I'm not a therapist. I'm their wife or I'm their friend. And so, for example, something that I do is I'm like, hey, can I bring you a meal? And you have permission to laugh, cry. I'll give you a shoulder to cry on if you want. You can scream, you can talk, you can be silent, but can I come? You know, and just offering that to them, that space, and that there's no expectations, or if I can help, fold laundry or clean or take their kids here or there, like just being a help in that time, giving them space, especially if there's like children or other family involved, trying to help alleviate some of those other pressures. Or grocery shopping, things that just that require some focus. Because when you're experiencing grief, and grief is a trauma, right? And we've actually, there's studies and scientists that talk about how experiencing grief is similar in the brain as having like a traumatic brain injury. Wow. And so there's a really deep physiological response. And so we get brain fog, we're confused, we can't focus. We show up in a grocery store and we're like, well, what did I come here for? Right? There's just a lot of these frustrating moments. And so the community can help alleviate some of those pressures by doing some of those things for them.
Oh, that's really good.
So we've been talking a lot about things that happen in therapy and ways that you'll receive help or tools to grow that mason jar, if I can say that. But I think one of the biggest hurdles is just getting to therapy, like starting that journey. And so I want to, for the listeners out there who aren't in therapy, but maybe need it, somebody's told them, like we've said, you should probably see a counselor or a therapist. I am a worst case scenario person. We'll just put that out there. So I think about every scenario. So for a person like that who holds himself back from an opportunity, what is the first step? Like, how do you even find a therapist today?
Well, yes. One of the great things that have come from this pandemic is that insurance companies are very aware of the need for counseling. And so a lot of insurance companies will have benefits. Okay. So the first place to look could be going through your insurance company and seeing what providers are in your area. And then you can make a phone call to those providers and say, hey, do you treat X, Y, and Z, or deal with these symptoms? Or do you have any males or females or young or old or faith-based or, whatnot, whatever you're looking for in that. And so insurance companies, internet, huge wealth resource, right? Also, if you were in a hospital setting, there are social workers there too that help point people in different directions. Okay. So there are so many resources, BetterHelp. There's also, if you're looking for a Christian therapist, there's American Association of Christian Counselors. And so anywhere you are in the world or in the States, you can go and Google who's in your area and then make those phone calls. And as I mentioned before too, if you don't feel like you've connected with that therapist, don't stop there. Like find somebody that you connect with, because that's a really, really important part of the relationship.
Yeah. And are there any questions that you should be asking your therapist when you're starting out in the therapy journey? Are there things that as the individual you should be looking for? I know you said obviously you're looking for them not to want you in there forever, right? But is there anything else that just helps the individual know like this is a good fit for me? Or
so I like to read bios. Okay. Like when I'm referring people, I like to read bios because I get like a taste for what a person's like. Yeah. Right. If a person is talking about like they like to take their time with their clients and get to know them and be a part of their journeys, because there are different what's called theoretical orientation. So take that one. So there's different approaches.
So smart.
I know.
Like we said earlier, she's so smart.
Oh gosh. So there's different approaches to therapy. And so some therapists are more of like, they don't say anything at all during session. And so they just let the person like lead the way and they don't say anything.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily my approach. I'm more talkative and I like to like get down in the dirt with them. And so a lot of those things aren't going to really be felt until like you're face to face. But there are, like I said, reading the bios or seeing reviews or even talking to them on the phone. A lot of them will do like 15-minute phone consultations or whatever. So talking to them on the phone. Yeah. Hearing their voice, seeing what their personality like. If they're like dry eyes, you know, you may not want to, go there. Or maybe you like that, or maybe you like that. I don't know.
True. And movies and TV for many years have put us in the mindset that we will lay down on a leather couch with a little pillow.
Yes.
Is that really what happens?
Well, in my office, you actually can lay down on the couch and I have a golden retriever. And so she will be all on you.
So Kelly's signing up right now.
I'm in.
Yeah, every therapy office is different.
Yeah.
But yeah, I always joke with people. I'm like, listen, therapy is not like you lay down and you tell me why the color yellow makes you sad. Like that's not what we do. Yeah. I know it's different than TV shows.
Yeah.
But I do have a couch. And so people have laid down. That's totally fine. I have blankets and pillows and snacks and water and like just make yourself at home. Yeah. Make it their own experience.
Yeah.
Well, Julianna, thank you so much for spending this time with us. We know that it's gonna help a lot of people in their journeys. And so, are there any last thoughts you have for anyone as you watch your friends, or as we watch our friends walk through grief?
Yeah. So one thing that I've experienced in my own life and going through different grief situations is that people will rush at the beginning of a tragedy, and they will be there to help, and they will be very supportive and do whatever it is that's needed. And in that time, like you're numb, like you're just trying to like figure out what's up and down and like what really has just happened. And so that adrenaline that we feel and that cortisol, like all of these surges that we get start to dwindle off at the 3-month mark. And by that time, that's when people have kind of like moved on. Like they've gone back to living their own life. Yeah. And so a really big encouragement I would give is to put reminders in your phone of anniversary dates, of birthdays. Put reminders to check in every month, every 3 months, every 6 months. Take them a meal or invite them out to lunch. Say the person's name of who's passed, like talk to them. Don't shy away from those kinds of conversations. You're not going to make them more sad. And I think that's a big lie that we believe is that like, if I say this, or
we
if I
don't
talk
want to bring
about
it up.
Yeah. But they want to, because it keeps that person alive.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would be my encouragement is just continue to follow up, because as the reality starts to set in that the person's not there, oftentimes that's when support kind of just starts to move on. So.
That's really great. Thank you again for being here. I think that this conversation alone is a tool, but I think it's unlocked just the reality of what you can experience in counseling. And as we have these further conversations about grief, I think it really sets it up well about the experiences that people have walked through and what we're going to hear about. So really appreciate you and everything that you do. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation. As we hoped, it was awesome.
It was awesome.
She is so great, not just for who she is, but I mean, wow, so wise, so helpful. There's such practical wisdom in what she shared, but also just the things that she's gone through and faced personally give us a greater understanding of what she's able to offer the people that she counsels. So I know for myself, one of the things she reiterated a few times that impacted me, because I'm human and I do want to help people take away their pain, is that that's not my job. And it's actually something I can't do. I'm there to help people just experience what they're experiencing and offer ways to support them, but I'm not a pain takeaway option.
No, you're not.
No, I'm not. I'm going to remind myself again, I cannot take away people's pain. Okay, Doug, what about you? What stuck out for you today?
Yeah, I think the image of the mason jars, where she talks about, the pain itself, it stays the same size, but we grow. And so there's that idea that the grief doesn't go away, but we grow through the pain. We become a different type of person, and that we should look forward to how grief can be a catalyst for our growth. And that to me, that's very encouraging, because sometimes grief can be all consuming and just sometimes overwhelmingly sad and depressing. But when we see like, what will this produce in me? How will I grow around this grief? That to me is a great visual, a great idea.
Yes, I love that. Deeply impactful to hear that and understand, like, yeah, there's an opportunity to grow out of this instead of trying to just get rid of something. So I want to say too, like, as we start this season, this is episode 2, we're going to go into some stories about grief with different groups of people. And I think the reason that it is important for us to talk about grief is because it's universal. Everybody experiences it in some way, shape, or form. And so as you're listening to this episode or listening maybe again to this episode, we don't want to just leave you here. Obviously, Julianna mentioned some really great resources that we're going to leave in the show notes. So if you are somebody that's looking for counseling, or you're somebody who wants to support somebody going through a season of grief, again, check out the show notes, check out the apps she mentioned, and local resources you have for support groups and counseling. And because we want to make sure that as we introduce different types of situations that have led to grief, that you have opportunities to seek out help yourself. So any last words, any last thoughts, Doug, as we go?
Yeah, I just say don't do it alone. God has provided people all around you, friend groups and experts, therapists to help walk you through your grief. So don't do it alone.
Don't be those people that say you don't need therapy, okay? Okay, you guys? All right, thanks for joining us. We look forward to talking to you soon.
See you soon.
Everything has a purpose, no growth without change.